welcome to the show, and thanks for checking us out. My guest today is author Christopher Hilton. He has written an amazing book here, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal. So obviously, if you're a listener of the show, you know that I love hair metal, and many of the artists of that era, I've had many of them on the show. So I thought I knew everything about hair metal, but I've actually learned a lot from reading this book. It's over 400 pages, and it starts in the beginning and works all the way up to the present day. And there was just a lot of great little nuggets in here, and we're really just scratching the surface of the book today. So do yourself a favor, order the book on Amazon, check it out. I think it's a good read for a diehard fan like myself, but also for someone who knows nothing about hair metal. And we're just going to hit on some of the highlights in this interview. It's a very fun conversation with Christopher Hilton. Enjoy. Welcome, Chris Hilton, to the Chuck Shoot podcast. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, Chuck. Hey, thanks for having me on. It's an honor and a privilege.
Yeah, this is great. I really enjoyed this book. We're going to get to that. But yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about your background. Obviously, you're a huge hair metal fan. I would almost say you're like a purist, like even more that people think I'm a real big hair metal. But I mean, there's like things where you're like, yeah, I didn't like this album because it sounded not hair metal enough. So, but one thing that's kind of a mystery to me is just your background. Other than you're a hardcore fan of the genre, like I need your origin story. Like how or why did you become such a fanatic? Because I'll tell you my background. I grew up in Seattle in the 90s, and I just became a hair metal fan at the cusp, like 91, 92. And it was, and then obviously all my friends listen to Alice in Chains and all that kind of thing. So what is your story? Like, did you grow up during this era? Did you have a lot of hair metal friends? Did you go to hair metal concerts? Or were you like me, just, in a bedroom reading Metal Edge and rocking out?
Well, maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
I guess I really entered the era in the mid 80s. So I was born in 74.
Okay.
So I was a little young to really be there at the start of this on the Sunset Strip in 1980 or 1981. I came on in the middle of the 80s, and it was a rather, inauspicious entry, I guess. In my, prior to my teen years in the earlier 80s, I was actually more of a fan of pop music. Whatever was on the radio, a top 40, whatever I was exposed to at the time. Huey Lewis in the News, or Billy Idol, Loverboy, Bryan Adams. I mean, heck, let's be candid. I even listened to Cyndi Lauper when I was 9 years old, I think.
Wow.
But I think it was 1986, about a year after its release, a friend played me a cassette of Motley Crue's Theater of Pain.
Okay.
I said, hey, this is a little different, right? What's going on here? And I think my real moment of truth by far didn't really come till probably a year after that. I don't really have many clear childhood memories for whatever it's worth, but I do vividly remember the first time I heard Welcome to the Jungle from Guns N' Roses' debut album, Appetite for Destruction. Our junior high bus driver would always let the cool kids, not me, mind you, submit their favorite cassettes on the way to the ride to school. You could bring your cassette, the bus driver would plug it in. And I'll never forget the feeling I had when I heard that song's, dramatic, haunting opening and that wicked chugging guitar riff. Not to mention, Axl Rose comes in with this snarling vocal styling, and, we were stuttering that phrase, watch it bring you to your knees. And I was like, whoa, what is this? I'd never heard anything like that on Top 40 radio that I knew about. And it was all hair metal from there, all 80s hard rock. Couldn't get enough of it. Absolutely lived and breathed it, for better or worse, for the last 30 some years.
Yeah. I mean, this book tells the story. You know more information than anyone I know. So were you in a big city? Were you able to go to and attend concerts, or?
I was about 40 minutes north of downtown Philadelphia. So At that time, there was the Spectrum Center. Okay. And yeah, starting about 13, 14 years old, I saw every band that came through town. And at that time, that would be probably 10, 11 shows a year. So my parents were very gracious in letting me head down to the Spectrum with whoever would be kind enough to take me and see all these bands. And, ever since then, I've been lucky enough to see, a good percentage of them every year since that time.
So you had, this is why I'm so jealous of people that grew up in this era. Like, you actually had friends that listened to the same kind of music, and you could go to concerts, and you guys are both enjoying these kinds of, because that was like so rare for me. Usually it was like a girlfriend at the time would tolerate it and go with me or something, or I'd go by myself, so
Well, you had some friends, right? I mean, as a hair metal fan, you're always going to be somewhat of an outcast, even at its peak.
Right.
And certainly I had a lot less friends that wanted to accompany me to anything like that after 1991.
That's what I was going to say, because you stuck with it. I'm guessing a lot of the other people started listening to grunge or Matchbox 20 or, adult contemporary or whatever. So, but yeah, let's break down the book here. So chapter 1, you break down the term hair metal, which you say you don't like it, but you also kind of need something to distinguish what this music is from regular heavy metal or hard rock, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, this is a very controversial but important topic, right? I mean, for those who have read the book, the first page of the first chapter starts off, it says, "I have a confession to make. I hate the term hair metal." That's the first sentence of the book.
Yeah.
And that's bizarre, right? Because if I hate the term, why would I lavish the idiom as the title and reference it so much? And it's really a bipolar kind of thing. Most people, I mean, the average fan would be surprised to know that the term hair metal wasn't even invented until years after the genre's heyday, which is generally considered to be 1986 to 1991. Up until that point, the music was all hard rock or even heavy metal. People today couldn't believe it, but in 1988, bands like Poison and Warrant were heavy metal.
Right.
Some used the term glam metal at the time, but it was all heavy metal. Hair metal wasn't invented until really after grunge, or during grunge. People needed a more disparaging, pejorative term, hair metal, implying that the genre was incredible, or it wasn't about the music, or it was about hair, or style with no substance. And of course, the bands hated this, and who can blame them? Because for the most part, I mean, this just wasn't true. I mean, sure, there were some bands, there's always going to be an exception, but for the most part, these were highly skilled musicians. The music was much harder to play and sing than something like grunge or alternative. Even the things that tend to stick out. Like I always use examples, CC DeVille from Poison, the guitarist from Poison, is like the signature hair metal goofball to the average observer. But he was classically trained guitarist, or a band like Winger. These are classically trained musicians. Kip Winger, has won a Grammy for writing a ballet score. Even a song like 17, right? Juvenile lyrics aside, 17 is a fairly intricate, complicated song to play. You're not just going to jump up as a bar band and bang out the riff to 17. At least I've never seen anybody do it. But I mean, like it or not, now 30 some years later, hair metal as a term has come to be, for better or worse, really like a universal identifier for this type of music. It's clear to the audience. When I thought about titling the book, I could have used the term glam metal, but then I thought, well, people could think this book is about David Bowie or Alice Cooper or the New York Dolls. And glam metal, I'm not sure is that much better, right? It's still glam.
Right,
still
yeah. They don't like that. Did you ever hear the term butt rock? Because that's what they called it when I was in Seattle. I had long hair. If I wore Metallica shirts and Guns N' Roses, oh, you're a butt rocker. And then when I remember saying that to Marcus Scott from Trickster, and he laughed. He'd never heard that term. And this was just like a couple years ago.
All, probably, and there's quite a few out there. But it was, how do we convey clarity to the reader? And I cringed at including this term as the book's title, not only because you're offending half the audience, the bands at least, for legitimate reasons. But again, when someone says hair metal, again, we can like it or not today, even like Hair Nation on XM Radio, I mean, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get Motley Crue, Poison, Skid Row, Warrant, Rat, Whitesnake, Bon Jovi. You can name them all day long. And the other thing is, I think for a lot of people, it's evolved to be less of a derogative term and more of a happily nostalgic term for a lot of people. Now, certainly not all, particularly hardcore fans like myself and the bands. If you were to say hair metal to Sebastian Bach or Nikki Sixx or even Joe Elliott, they're going to rip your stomach out through your throat if they can, and I don't blame them. But hey, we wanted to be clear about the title.
Right. So
I hate it, but I accept it, and I'm going to use it to convey the message. But trust me, I'll get behind anybody any day of the week who says the word should never be uttered by anyone.
Yeah, I don't mind it personally, but so your book here. So originally, again, I like I said, when I got it in the mail, I was like, oh my God, this thing's over 400 pages, but the original text was over 800 pages. You have over 1,000 hair metal CDs and 1,000 more on your hard drive. And you wake up every day and you check the 8 or 9 different hair metal websites. I mean, are you the most
with me, right?
What? You are the most hardcore fan. I mean, even harder than me. I think most people think I'm a really big hardcore hair metal fan, but I mean, how did you become such a loyal fan because like we said, in the 90s, a lot of people kind of, even myself, I think there was times where I kind of just lost touch with some of the scene because there just wasn't music being pumped out.
Well, I think, some of it is the music and the genre itself. All music has its dedicated fans, but some genres have fans that are more fickle than others, perhaps, right? Hair metal or 80s based hard rock has some really, really passionate, devoted fans. And, the people that dropped off in the 90s, they're casual fans, the people who were fans because it's what they saw on MTV, or it's what was being pushed on radio, or it was the in thing at the time. At least it was for a few years there at the end. But a lot of people, have never let go of the genre and have held on to it much more, I think, than people hold on to other genres. Probably, I would say more so than things like grunge. Country fans tend to be pretty passionate as well. But the average hair metal fan, you're not. It's hard to be half a hair metal fan.
Yeah,
you either don't dig it or you're super, super passionate about it. And that's what's great about reading and writing about the genre and speaking with other people about it. It's just a lot of passion for this music. And, people grow up and they do different things, and maybe they don't focus on music as much as they could, but they never lose that spark for it for the most part, at least not the hardcore fans.
Right.
And there's plenty of us out there, 30 million people bought Hysteria. So, maybe there's still not 30 million people that are hardcore fans, but even a very small percentage of 30 million is a lot of people, right?
Right. No, that's true. So in the beginning, my girlfriend asked me this the other day. She goes, "So who's the first hair metal band?" I'm like, well, I don't know. So in your book, you kind of talk about Van Halen is that maybe the first hair band? I mean, would you call them a hair band?
Well, there's no definitive answers to these questions, which makes them so much fun.
Yeah.
It's a two-pronged thing. I mean, hair metal's origins, right? They trace all the way back to the 70s. When you think about hair metal, and again, everyone forgive me for using the term, but when you think about, what it stood for or what it encompassed, and you think about the theatrics of it and, the aggressiveness of the music and the styling and the highly, party-based nature. But from an aesthetic standpoint, you think of David Bowie, you think of Kiss, Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, the New York Dolls, Hanoi Rocks, Cheap Trick. All of these bands presented something that would eventually influence the hair metal template as we came into the 80s. Even Led Zeppelin to an extent, right? When you think about the heavy riffs with still the melodic type of music.
And they had the hair. They had the long hair.
And they had, you check the box there.
Yeah.
But yeah, Van Halen, I personally don't think of bands as hair metal, right? Because I hate the term. I employ it in the book. But if you group them all under that generalized genre, and I don't think of Van Halen as a hair metal band, although they're a big part of the book because from the average person's view, they're going to fit in that stereotype. But they did have a lot of the blueprints for what it would become, right? They had, when you think about David Lee Roth and you think about hair metal, you think of this flamboyant, charismatic frontman, right? This showman, the ringleader. I mean, there's no better epitome than that than David Lee Roth. You think about all the guitar virtuosos and the focus on the guitar solo and the shredding and the riffs. And is there any better example than Eddie Van Halen for, you can't pick out a guitarist in a hair metal band who didn't have Eddie Van Halen as a primary influence. I mean, you probably just couldn't.
Right.
And it had this thundering bass and rhythm section. And most of all, it took the elements of heavy metal, right, which was loud, aggressive music, and combined it with these pop sensibilities. That was really what hair metal evolved to, especially as you got to the mid 80s and albums like Slippery When Wet really broke through. You had things that pop could embrace, the top 40 could embrace, these melodic pop-based songs combined with heavy guitar riffs and this loud, aggressive nature of the music. And that's what it really came about. And Van Halen had a lot of that from the start. They had melody to the music, and it was a party band, right? It wasn't a heavy metal band in terms of, bang your head. It was a party band. But as you came into the early 80s, everyone's aware of what, Motley Crue got their teeth cut in the early 80s. Quiet Riot really had the biggest commercial breakthrough and really knocked down the door for all the other bands to have success and get record labels with Metal Health and Come On Feel the Noise. And Metal Health, we know is the first #1 heavy metal album and knocking the Police's Synchronicity off the charts at the time. And then, of course, you had Def Leppard coming over from the other side of the ocean, Rat, Surround Around. Rat was everything hair metal was, along with Motley Crue and Wasp and Dokken in 1982 and 1983. Twisted Sister had this. Yeah. They have been toiling around since the 70s as well. And they had these 2 huge videos, and suddenly MTV came about and put faces to names. And all of a sudden, Twisted Sister was in the average homeowner's living room.
Yeah.
We're not going to take it.
Do you think those first 2 Motley Crue albums, so the first one's Too Fast for Love, and the second one, Shout at the Devil, both 2 very different sounding albums. They definitely have that kind of like hair metal look in a way, the hair, the kind of makeup and the leather. But the first album sounds punk to me. And then the second album sounds almost just like classic heavy metal. It really wasn't until Theater of Pain that they kind of had the more hair metal sound. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, their first album, now again, this was a very raw recording. We know they did it independently before Elektra took it and remastered it, remixed it. But there's a lot of elements on that first album, right? There's, to your point, there's punk. When you think about songs like Too Fast for Love, there's even pop elements. Think about a very melodic song like Starry Eyes. There's the heavy metal aggressive nature of a song like Livewire, but there's a lot of things on that album for sure. And I think they really did, to your point, refine their sound and hit their exact groove for what was going on at the Sunset Strip at the time with Shout at the Devil. I mean, this was just probably leaps and bounds beyond what their peers were doing. They took the opportunity to record a proper record with a proper budget with Elektra, and to their credit, they took advantage of it. It was bigger in every way. It was glossier in every way. It was still raw. But like I said, with a band like Motley Crue in '83 and Shout at the Devil, at the same time with what Rat and Wasp and Dokken were doing, along with Twisted Sister and Quiet Riot, that was everything at the beginning. That laid all the blueprint. And you're right. I mean, Theater of Pain was more of a, certainly from an image standpoint, Motley Crue did the crazy thing that no other band would be crazy enough to do, of changing their image and to somewhat their sound and even their logos with every single record as they went through the 80s. But they adopted a bluesier, certainly a lot more glam look as they came into Theater of Pain. Shout at the Devil was like the war paint costumes, right? And the pentagram. And then we got
Road Warrior.
Theater of Pain, yes. And you had these, fishnet pink outfits and spandex. A lot of Motley Crue fans were turned off by that at the time.
Yeah, and then you said that in the book, the Home Sweet Home, which is obviously one of their biggest hits, biggest songs, still popular years later, that you hear it on commercials or it was in Hot Tub Time Machine and stuff, movies. But when they sent that record to the record company thought they were joking. When they put that song on the record, they're like, "Oh, that's funny. You're not going to put that." And they're like, "No, we like the song and we want to release it." And it ended up being so popular on Dial MTV that they made a rule to retire the videos after 30 days because it just kept getting. They're like, "Okay, we need to play a different song, or we're going to be like a pretty boring show." I thought that stuff was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that "Home Sweet Home" was the first power ballad, and I don't exactly subscribe to that. You think about songs like. And it depends how you define power ballad, but as you think of the 80s stereotypical power ballad, and the roots were sown long before that. Aerosmith's Dream On, even Kisses Beth, Dokken's Alone Again, The Scorpions Still Loving You, Twisted Sister's The Price, even Stairway to Heaven, right? These all had the roots of what would become the power ballad. But there is no doubt that what Motley Crue did with Home Sweet Home definitely cemented that particular version of what would become literally thousands and thousands of, you hate to use the word copycat, but that sent the template for what people think of as the 80s power metal ballad. And you're right. I mean, they took it to their record company. And I mean, one thing was clear at the time. If you can transport yourself back to that day and age, heavy metal bands didn't play ballads in the record company's view. And they thought it was a legitimate joke. And, to the band's credit, they fought for it to be on there. They even financed the video themselves. And then after that, I mean, of course, you couldn't put out an 80s hard rock album without having at least one ballad.
Right.
You couldn't do it.
Yeah. So another song that was kind of I don't know if it was necessarily a joke, but the song Jump by Van Halen. I didn't know this, that actually Eddie Van Halen had written that song years before, but David Lee Roth kept rejecting it. So how did he finally get him to agree to play it?
Well, from what I've read about that, of course, I wasn't there. But yeah, David Lee Roth rejected that many times because he didn't believe in the movement from the guitar-based rock to the synthesizers and the keyboards. Now, of course, this was just blossoming in the early 80s with new wave. And that was really what a lot of the bands on the Sunset Strip were up against at the time, is new wave pop and Duran Duran and bands like that. And so David Lee Roth was very much against this introduction of keyboards. And as a musician, Eddie Van Halen really wanted to expand what he was doing. He was fascinated with keyboards and synthesizers. And you could see throughout Van Halen's career, as we went later into the 80s, it's something he became much more embracive of. But finally, I'm not sure what it was that made David Lee Roth relent on the topic. I think I read once it was record label pressure, which doesn't surprise anybody.
Okay.
At the end of the day, he said, "Hey, I was wrong. It's a huge hit."
Yeah.
And later on, he would even build his own version of that sentiment. When we think about songs like Just Like Paradise, Steve Vai hated that song because he thought it was commercial pop dribble. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it was still a huge hit.
Right.
So there was something to be said for the introduction of these keyboards and synthesizers as it related to top 40 radio and commercial success.
Absolutely. So another piggybacking on the David Lee Roth. So this was interesting too, that he did a solo record, Crazy from the Heat, and they were going to make a movie, and it was $20 million, and the movie was 80% finished, and then they scrapped it. So what happened to that? Can we find like the 80% done copy? Because I'm really curious what this movie was about, or what. It's really interesting.
Actually, you can, believe it or not. It was CBS Studios, and you're right, they had greenlit it for some exorbitant amount of money, right? And David Lee Roth and everyone who was working on the project put, a solid 13 months in this thing, and it was 80% down the road. At the end of the day, there was some restructuring in CBS Studios, and it decided to get scrapped at the 11th hour. Now, of course, they took a lot of the songs that were to be the soundtrack for that, and they became Eat 'Em and Smile, and almost all of the props and the costumes and the set pieces went into all the videos. So it wasn't, but if you Google it, I think it wasn't so long ago, it was less than 24 months ago, at least, I think it was 50 some pages of the script were published on the internet for the first time. Of course I read them because, God knows what's wrong with me. But of course, it was exactly what it was explained to be. It was a movie about David Lee Roth as an entertainer. He was going to star, and it was island life, and it had all these crazy circus-like characters, and it was a musical. And so, what we wouldn't give to have seen that come to fruition. But yeah, and
that's
it never
interesting.
Came to fruition. At the time, you didn't know because this is a non-internet age.
Right.
You only know this in retrospect. And that's one of the reasons I thought the book could be so enjoyable for people because, today, everything about bands, everything about the music, and everything's on the internet. But at the time, you only knew what you could read, to your earlier comment, in Hit Parader or Metal Edge, or the very rare interview that might make a more commercial publication, or you didn't even see these bands outside of MTV or the once a year they came to your town. So there's a lot of great stories out there.
Oh yeah. Well, this is a great story too. Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet, 1986, one of the biggest quote unquote hair metal albums of all time, and Living on a Prayer, one of the biggest songs of all time. But this actually almost didn't make the cut because John Bon Jovi didn't think it was strong enough.
Yeah, I mean, according to him, if I quote him right, he said he just knew it as a song that was kind of average, and he remembered the only thing he remembered about it is it got really high at the end and was difficult to sing. Right? So he didn't think this was good enough. And luckily, Richie Sambora said, "Hey, listen, you got a huge hit here. It has to make the record." One of the other interesting things about that record, and as we're speaking about songs that made it or didn't make it,
Edge of a Broken Heart.
Edge of a Broken Heart.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah, that's such a great song too, and that actually didn't make it. But wasn't it on like a soundtrack to the movie Orderlies or something? Yeah.
Yes, it was on the Orderlies soundtrack. It eventually wound up on the box set.
Okay.
Bon Jovi fans can't be wrong. But yeah, I mean, in my opinion, when you look at what they did in the 80s and that style of music, I mean, that's one of the best songs. That's one of the top 5 songs they had, I think, from that time period. And again, was something they didn't feel was strong enough to make the record. Now, since then, John Bon Jovi has admitted he might not be the best judge of what goes on records and has apologized for Edge of a Broken Heart not making it. Of course, you're aware when they did New Jersey, they did some of this on Slippery When Wet, but they used the full focus group. Right, they got fans in a room, and again, this is pre-internet, and they bring 30 fans in, and it was supposed to be a double record. It was titled "Sons of Beaches" at the time. And of course, the records company said, "Heck no, you're not doing a double album. Every band always wants to do a double album. It's always commercial suicide for the most part." And so they brought in focus groups to come in and say, "Hey, rank the songs, listen to the songs." And I thought that was really interesting. Of course, Bon Jovi was a huge commercial machine at that time. So do something like that. And the biggest ranking songs coming out of those sessions by the fans, Born to Be Your Baby, which we know. But the other ones were Wild in the Wind, and I think it was Stick to Your Guns, which is surprising because those 2 songs never even got released as singles, but those were the 3 that ranked highest in the focus groups.
Okay.
That's how they chose the song selection for New Jersey.
Yeah. So Poison, this is the same 86, the same time. Look What the Cat Dragged In. That's like, I mean, that is the stereotypical hair metal. But this is something that was interesting. I don't know if I knew this and I forgot it, but it was in the book that you talk about how Slash from Guns N' Roses actually auditioned for Poison, which is kind of a weird thing if you think about it. But it kind of makes you wonder, what if he had joined that band? I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting.
Well, the thing people don't realize is, on the Sunset Strip at that time, particularly 1981 up through 1986, really, all of the bands, were rotating members amongst themselves. All right. You had literally thousands of bands, and a lot of them from this genre were on the strip. The most common thing people are aware of is when they think about LA Guns and Guns N' Roses. I mean, Tracy Guns played in a band with Axl Rose, who played in a band with Izzy Stradlin, and they went back and forth. And people were coming in and out of these bands literally 3, 4, 5 different times. But yeah, when Poison lost their guitarist, Matt Smith, if I recall correctly, I think his wife got pregnant and he wanted to go home to Pennsylvania, just wasn't sure they would make it. They were living in the back of the laundromat at the time, and they were auditioning new guitarists. They auditioned quite a few. And from what I read, it came down to Slash and, of course, CeCe DeVille. And, they said, hey, Slash killed his guitar part, as you would expect he would. But Poison had a very specific look at the time.
He wasn't pretty enough.
It wasn't pretty enough, perhaps, right? He certainly didn't dress the part. He came in, as the story goes, with some moccasins on, and Bret Michaels says, those aren't the shoes you're going to wear on stage, are they? And, they had this really kitschy thing where they would interrupt their set at the time and, introduce themselves. And, they would say, hey, I'm Bobby, or hey, I'm Bret. And Slash was like, I am not saying, hi, I'm Slash. Not doing this.
No.
And,
so he joins Guns N' Roses, and the rest, they put out Appetite for Destruction. I don't think a lot of people know that took a while to take off. And I don't know if I even knew this part, that It's So Easy was actually the first single from that record. I don't know if I knew that. And then the video was banned on MTV. What's that?
Not a lot of people heard it.
Well, I love that song. It's interesting because that is I remember when I first got the album. I mean, obviously I'd heard the pop songs on the radio, but when I bought the full album, I think that was one of the first songs that jumped out whoa, this song is so crazy. And it's, Axl's doing it almost doesn't even sound like Axl Rose, which is so crazy, but it's almost more of a punk song as well.
Yeah, that was the thing that made it such a bizarre choice for the first single, is that, first of all, it's laced with profanity, right? So
so was it an edited version that they put out, or
not that I don't know how you could really. You'd have to take out a third of the song, so radio wouldn't touch it. And of course they shot a super expensive video for it that was filled with extremely violent images that of course MTV said they're not going to touch. And then also you talk about Axl Rose's vocal stylings. I mean, he sings the verses of that song in his very, very lowest register. It just had very little to do with what most of the album was about. So it was a bizarre choice for lead single. But yeah, people don't realize, all you do is you think backwards and you think, oh, Appetite for Destruction, it's a huge album, right? It must have been a hit as soon as it came out. I mean, that was almost a full year before that thing broke. And, you can read the story in the book to your point. But, they were about to give up on it. The record labels and said, go in and do your second album. We're not getting any more, can't squeeze any more juice out of this thing. And finally, a last ditch effort, one of the label execs called on a favor at MTV and said, could you please play the video for Welcome to the Jungle? And they reluctantly agreed. They said, fine, we'll play it. I think it aired at, 2 a.m. or 4 a.m.
4 a.m. Yeah. And you said the switchboard lit up. Yeah, that's crazy. No, I remember I had Brian Forsyth from Kix on my show. And he was saying they were friends, with Guns N' Roses and stuff. And Slash was saying, wow, your album's doing so good. And I think it was Brian Forsyth. It was one of somebody, I feel like it was him or somebody that I had. And he was trying to console Slash and go, oh, no, don't worry. Your album will do okay. And then, of course it blew up or whatever. But that same year, 87, so many good albums, Def Leppard, White Snake, but Crue, again, one of my favorites. What's kind of interesting? When I was reading this, I was kind of thinking about this album, Girls, Girls, Girls. Now, this is when Nikki Sixx is doing all the heroin. So you would think the music would have had a darker kind of Alice in Chains dirt kind of thing, but it wasn't at all. It was very hey, girls, girls, girls. And, all this fun, how did he write that stuff and being in such a dark place?
Yeah, that was definitely the height of his heroin addiction. He started on the Theater of Pain album and really hit its peak then. And, I think Girls, 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 I love the album, sure, but, I don't rank it very high amongst Motley's entire catalog because I think it did suffer from some of that for sure. I think it, like a lot of Motley's albums, they kind of saved their career with just a couple of songs. On Theater of Pain, it was the pop cover of the Brownsville Station song, Smoke in the Boys Room and Home Sweet Home. On Girls, 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 Wild Side and the title track were undeniably, inspired moments, and they belong on any Motley Crue best of. But after that, the album kind of falls off a cliff a little bit. There's some other good songs in there. I think Dancing on Glass.
I like that song. 5 Years Dead. I like that one.
Yeah, and there was some darker elements. I mean, Dance on Glass itself is a story about heroin. 5 Years Dead a little bit, but songs like Bad Boy Boogie. Some of the average Crue fan probably sees that as a little bit of filler. It only really had 8 tracks to offer in total anyway, because Nikki Sixx was not at the peak of his songwriting prowess, being hooked on heroin. If
What's
you throw out Nona, Jailhouse Rock, there's only 8 songs on that album.
What's funny is when they re-released it, and it had, I want to say, is the song Rodeo. I love that song. I was like, dude, this song is great. Why didn't you put this on the original?
Yeah, I would have actually preferred that as a ballad to You're All I Need. I didn't really care much for You're All I Need. Of course, neither did MTV, because they had that crazy violent video, which seemed to be a pattern of the Crue sabotaging themselves at the time.
Right.
And Vince Neil was in his absolutely highest vocal range on that song. But I love the song Radio. If there's a Crue fan out there who hasn't heard it, it's a great song. They should definitely track it down.
Is in that same year Aerosmith? I mean, they're kind of on the they kind of went through. I would say that they're not a hair metal band, but they went through a hair metal phase. And they released that album. It was so great. It's got Dude Looks Like a Lady, Ragdoll, Angel. But the song Dude Looks Like a Lady, I feel like I've heard this debate. Is it about Bret Michaels or Vince Neil, or both?
The story goes it's about Vince Neil.
Okay. I thought it was about, because I thought I heard other people say it was about Bret Michaels. So it's actually 100% Vince Neil then.
That is what I understand. And you're right. I think, Aerosmith, when people talk about which bands were and weren't hair metal, and it's a fantastic discussion, by the way, we should get into it. But, the first bands that get thrown out are Van Halen and Aerosmith. And there's a reason for that. There's a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Aerosmith went through what you might call a hair metal phase. Again, when we talk about taking these aggressive, groovy guitar riffs and combining them with really pop melodic songs. And, they had their comeback album before that. It didn't really work out for them. But hey, on Permanent Vacation, here come the outside writers, right? The people that can write hit songs like Ragdoll and Dude Looks Like a Lady. And suddenly, they're on radio. And this time in their pocket, they have MTV, right? Which was really the primary vehicle for any band to succeed.
Right.
And I think influenced a lot of the genre in the extent that people talk about glam and fashion. And hey, let's face it, in a non-internet age, the only vehicle you had for exposure was MTV at the time. And if you want to be on MTV, you got to look pretty.
Yeah.
That's just the way it was.
For sure. So
it was a hair metal type sounding album. And again, forgive me, the Aerosmith purists out there are going to take great offense to this. And I hear them loud and clear. But it shared a lot of similarities with the way that music was constructed at the time.
I thought it was interesting too. I don't know. You don't really go over this too much in your book, but you do talk about how Aerosmith was recording the next album, Pump, next to Motley Crue during their Dr. Feelgood, and they kind of reminisce or they talk about being sober. But when I had Karabi on here, he was saying that I was like, so they were sober when they recorded the Motley Crue, and he goes, sorta. Like he was saying they'd start out with the fridge was full of water and Diet Coke, and then he's like slowly it would go and start filling up with beer and stuff. And I was like, oh, because if you read the dirt, they talk about falling off the wagon. There's at least 2 instances they talk about in the book, but according to Karabi, there was a lot more that maybe didn't make the book. There was a lot of he said they were trying, and he didn't want to badmouth anybody's sobriety, but it sounds like it was a process at that point. I think that stuff's kind of interesting. There's
certainly a lot of truth to that. I mean, the narrative goes that they were sober. Right. And certainly, they did all go to rehab after, the Girls Goes Goals tour, which, by some miracle didn't end in their death. I mean, technically it ended in Nikki Sixx's death.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, they all went to rehab. And I think, their management said, listen, you guys, you have to get sober. You have to do something different or it's going to end. And I think they made, whatever attempt Motley Crue could make. Now, how sober is sober? I think, only those that were there are going to know. But to your point, I don't think it was 100% pure. Were they more sober than in the past? Quite likely. And there were times did they fall off the wagon? Sure. But I mean, when you think about what they did on that album, Bob Rock took them up to Vancouver. I mean, he put them through the paces like they'd never been put through before in terms of a real focus on the absolute best they could do musically and songwriting and production. That was their chance to really emerge from this thing and either make it to the top of the hard rock heap or don't, or flame out. And to their credit, they did. And for most of that tour, we can call them mostly sober, but Motley Crue was a machine on that Dr. Feelgood tour, right? They were tight. They were on top of their game. They were lean and fit and mean and nasty. Vince Neil was at probably the height of his vocal ability. that was quite the tour to see. I remember that one vividly.
Oh, that would have been cool. Yeah. So there's some really interesting facts that I think, I don't know if I knew these and forgot or just didn't know it, but as I'm reading, you're talking about Warrant. The song Heaven was actually had to be re-recorded. And another fact that was interesting, Mr. Big, the singer Eric Martin, I did not know he auditioned for Van Halen and Toto.
Yeah.
That's news to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's the beauty of, being able to read things like this. Like today, you would know that. But, at the time, unless it made Metal Edge or Rip or whatever it is you were reading, I mean, you wouldn't know as a fan, but it's super interesting.
Yeah.
And there's something fans like almost just as much as listening to this style of music. It's learning more about it and talking about it with other fans and hopefully reading about it. But yeah, Heaven was interesting. And I don't know that it was a full re-record. It was at least a remix.
Okay.
It did touch up some things. But the record company got kind of caught with his pants down. They didn't realize the huge single that they had in their hand. Once it started to break, they said, wait a second, let's get back in here and let's give this, at the time they would call it a bigger, louder, more powerful sound, more reminiscent of what you think is the traditional big bombastic power ballad. And let's get this thing ready for radio. But that was pretty unconventional at the time, right? I mean, bands weren't called in to remix or remaster or re-record pieces of things just because they thought they had a hit on their hands. So it's kind of a unique piece of history there. Yeah.
And then, I mean, the other story with Warren, I think most people know this about how, it was supposed to be called, the Cherry Pie album was supposed to be called Uncle Tom's Cabin. But then the record company wanted a Love in the Elevator kind of type of song. And so Jain Lane went back in and, wrote this thing on the lyrics on a pizza box. And by the way, do you know where those lyrics are? Because I heard they were in a Hard Rock hotel in Florida, but I cannot find that anywhere on the internet. That's something that you might know. No? Okay.
If somebody has that pizza box, I'd be impressed.
Yeah. I thought it was on a Hard Rock, but but this is something I didn't know. I thought I knew everything about Warrant. The opening scream in Cherry Pie is Dee Snider. And it's like, they lifted it from another album. That's so bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, and to this day, I don't know why Beau Hill chose to do that.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, but for whatever reason, he lifted it off a Twisted song off, I think it was the Love is for Suckers album, if I remember properly. And,
the song was called I Want This Night to Last Forever, according to your book.
Yeah, that was it. If you were the average fan at the time, and I was included, I mean, why wouldn't you think that was Jain Lane? Mm-hmm. Why would you do that? I have no idea. But yeah, that's actually decent. And he's not credited anywhere on the album liner notes. But
sounds like a lawsuit.
Well, I think things were a little looser back in the day, but who knows? So. But that's Dee Snider. Absolutely.
And so speaking of writing on pizza boxes, and we have another one that was scratched out on a napkin. So the Young Guns too, Emilio Estevez, he wanted to use Wanted Dead or Alive, the Bon Jovi song. And John Bon Jovi said, I don't think that's a good fit. So he's having dinner with Emilio Estevez and Kiefer Sutherland, which, God, to be a fly on the wall of those three guys, that would be fun. And he scratches out on a napkin or 3 napkins, the song Blaze of Glory. I mean, did he write the whole song or just some of the lyrics on that? Like, what's the story there?
I mean, I'm not sure. I've never seen the napkins, to your point, like the pizza box. So I'm not sure he had the full score. But yeah, I mean, supposedly he had the majority of the song there written by the end of lunch, handed it across the table. And, he thought Wanted Dead or Alive wasn't a good fit. I mean, naturally, they were attracted to it because it's got this Western theme, which fits the movie. Yeah. But he said, hey, this song's about life on the road and in a touring band. If you really listen to the lyrics, he said, I'll give you your song. And, to his credit, to the extent John's an amazing songwriter in some instances, banged it out right there. And of course it becomes a huge #1 hit. And he wound up, writing the entire soundtrack to the movie as his first solo album. But isn't it amazing the way these things transpired at the time?
Oh yeah, no, I love it. And 1990 was just, we talk about Warrant and Poison as an album, Firehouse and Trickster, all these bands. I mean, this is like almost the peak. Do you remember the episode of Full House where Danny Tanner goes to a Slaughter concert?
I do not.
Oh,
you would think I should know that. But
that's I do not know that. They don't show the band or anything. Yeah, they just talk about it. I just remember that, like, as a kid going, like, I think that's how I first heard about Slaughter. But, and then 91. I mean, I think 91, in my opinion, is the best year for music, if not at least rock music, and not only hair metal. Because I know you're a purist, but I am a rock fan, and I mean, they had Nirvana's album, Metallica. And you even talk about Metallica and Ozzy. And I mean, if you look at all the rock albums, I mean, even grunge, Pearl Jam and Nirvana, I mean, there's so many great albums from that year. And I think you put #1, which I love, Skid Row, Slave to the Grind. And that's the first album for me that made me a fan of rock music. I was into rap at the time, and a girl I was dating played that. And I was like, what is this? And then that's what sold me on rock music. So that's crazy. So it's a personal fave for both of us. But it's kind of interesting because, like I said, you're more of a purist. So you didn't think it was too heavy?
Well, I mean, so I appreciate certainly, what you think of as generalized 80s hair metal, but, I like a lot of the things that these bands evolved to that wasn't 80s hair metal, and this is a good example. There's tons of others, specifically the 1994 album that Motley Crue did with John Crosby. I mean, I love that album, and that had nothing to do with hair metal.
Right.
So I'm certainly not limited to the 80s version of what these bands did. But yeah, it's hard to classify. I mean, first of all, a lot of people would say Skid Row should never be classified as hair metal anyway, just because they were, they didn't really have that type of fashion, although they certainly had the hair. We keep coming back to that. But, they were a heavier band. But the self-titled debut, of course, got its commercial wings on the ballads or the pseudo ballads with I Remember You and 18 in Life, very typical of the hair metal template at that time. But songs like Youth Gone Wild or Making a Mess, I mean, these were heavier than what the Poisons and the Warrants and the Bon Jovis were doing at the time by far, but they still had that melodic sensibility. But Slave to the Grind, I mean, you're not going to meet anyone that's going to say this is a hair metal album in any way, shape, or form. I mean, this is just a full-on, brutal, vicious assault of a hard rock album. I mean, I thought it was amazing, right? I actually liked it at the time. The bands were getting harder and heavier and slightly bluesier. As a fan, I was evolving too. But I liked the direction bands were taking in that vein. But it's a beast, right? I mean, by the time you get done Slave to the Grind, and it's one of those rare albums you don't have to skip a single track. I mean, you just feel like you've been run over by a truck. Sebastian Bach was absolutely at his peak of vocal powers at the time. He had that twin guitar attack, just crazy riffs, and you didn't have the super sappy 80s power ballads, but you still had 3 ballad type songs, but these weren't traditional ballads. I mean, these were heavy, dramatic, strong, amazing pieces. And the other songs, even though they were brutally heavy, I mean, they still had melody. And Skid Row was really good at that, at least in the first couple albums.
I think so too.
It's always going to be in my top 5 for sure.
Yeah, me
it's
too.
Not a hair metal.
I love it. So, and then the Guns N' Roses, obviously Appetite's a huge success, 30 million or whatever copies sold. But then the Use Your Illusions. And you talk about some interesting things, why this was different. Obviously it's a double album, but the band didn't write as a group as they did with Appetite. And then obviously they didn't have Steven Adler, the drummer, and that changed the group's, you said swing from Appetite. And it is interesting. I love Matt Sorum. I think he's a great drummer, but something about Adler's drumming on that first album. It sounds, I don't know. It's a sound like, I feel like, I don't know what the technical term is, but Sorum uses a lot of it's kind of more like a pounding, like deep drum. And I feel like,
for sure.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like Adler's a little lighter. And I don't know, something about that, but You Could Be Mine is the best song you said, and that was actually written during the Appetite sessions. I'm fascinated why that wouldn't have made the album, because it's a great song. And you also talk about how Axl kind of overproduced some of the songs on Use Your Illusions. Like they originally had a production similar to Appetite, but people would leave and then Axl would be found in the studio alone tinkering with the songs from 2 a.m. to 7 a.m., layering all sorts of technology and other kinds of things. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, Guns N' Roses is somewhat unique in the sense, I mean, it was really the sum of the whole. The whole was more than the sum of the parts, right? Each member of that band brought something very unique and special and integral to that music and that sound they had in Appetite for Destruction, right? Axl is extremely distinct in terms of what he's doing as a vocalist. Slash, from a guitar standpoint, he could shred, but he was much more in the Joe Perry kind of Aerosmith, let's get a riff on it. Duff brought the punk sensibilities. Izzy was a tremendous songwriter, first of all, but what he was doing with rhythm guitar, he had a way of perfectly complemented what Slash was doing in these unique, inventive rhythm guitar parts that didn't take over the songs, but were a perfect accompaniment to what Slash was playing. And Steven Adler, yeah, I mean, the guy is not, on your top tier of technical drummers, but he had a certain, people use the term swing about him, and he gave those songs a feel, for better or worse. But everything had changed, to your point, by Use Your Illusions, right? I mean, Guns N' Roses was a different entity. And they weren't writing songs together in a cockroach infested apartment as teenagers anymore. They weren't writing songs in the back of a van on some tour up to Seattle. They were largely separated and bringing in songs that were mostly pre-written by individuals, and the rest of the group would kind of add what they could. The first songs in Appetite for Destruction, someone would sit down with a riff and all 5 of them in a circle, and they're each putting their stamp on that, and everyone's bringing something to the table. It just wasn't that conjunctive effort on the album. And yeah, I mean, some people are big fans of the albums, and certainly they are, by any objective measure, a tremendous success commercially, and even for what they were. I was not a big fan just because I don't think they had much in common with the Appetite for Destruction sound.
Yeah, but you did make your own. I think I've done this too. You made your own Use Your Illusion one album. You put all the songs, and I would argue, we're going to have a debate about this later, but I would argue some of the songs, and I don't want to give it away because I think people should check out the book and see what your list is and see how it compares to theirs. But here's a totally random, there's, like I said, 91 was so good. But I didn't know this. I'm a Danger fan, and the album Screw It, I believe that was 91, correct? I didn't know that was originally supposed to be called Monkey Business, based with the song Monkey Business, but then they thought, because Skid Row had the song Monkey Business, it was too much Monkey Business, so they just called it Screw It. But that song Monkey Business by Danger, that's a really underrated song. Why wasn't that a bigger hit? I thought it was a great song.
I'm a big Danger fan too, and I thought Screw It was actually their better album. Most people like the debut, but it gets into something which I'm sure we're going to come to. And at that point,
here we go. Yep.
Right. You can't avoid this when you're talking about the genre. The supply started to just outstrip the demand.
Yeah. Right? And too many.
Too many. Too much. Saturation. Nothing overly new and inventive. I love that album. But when they found out Skid Row was having success with the title, they became frustrated. And, the record company was trying to talk them into something different. And they eventually, got all upset and they just said, F it. And they said, okay, well, then we'll just call the album Screw It. So that became the title.
Yeah.
So bizarre things that happen when people are coming up with these things.
So the music scene is changing, and, people talk about grunge killing hair metal. Now you say, this is interesting. I'm going to kind of debate you a little bit on this one. You say that it was a simplified or lower level of musicianship. But don't you think the songwriting was much more original and complex, especially the lyrics for some of that grunge music? It was really like Alice in Chains' Dirt. Especially the sound on that was so unique. I can understand if you don't really like it, but you have to admit, like, some of the originality was, I feel like it kind of needed to happen.
Oh, absolutely. When you talk about musicianship, first of all, let's put the elephant in the room on the table, right? How much talent and musicianship does it take to write "I Want Action" or "Talk Dirty to Me," right?
Right.
These are not Mozart's or Beethoven's symphony.
Sure.
I think the musician aspect of it stood out when you think about when you were a guitar player in the mid '80s on the Sunset Strip. To compete with the Eddie Van Halens and the Warren DeMartinis and the Vito Brattas of the world, you had to be a top-notch virtuoso guitarist, right? And it's certainly not a detriment to grunge, but they simply didn't employ that kind of music. It was more 3-chord, strum along. That's not to say there wasn't other things that were more complicated, but the average kid coming out of the average garage could play grunge songs. You weren't going to go out there and shred like Steve Vai, not without a lot of dedication. And it's all personal preference for sure. But the average person is not going to be able to sing like Axl Rose or Sebastian Bach in their prime. Now, again, these stylings aren't for everybody, but the average person could get closer, to singing like Kurt Cobain. And not that, he wasn't extremely talented, because I think he was extremely talented for sure. But yeah, there's this popular sentiment out there that, grunge killed hair metal, or more specifically, people will tell you Nirvana killed hair metal. And you read the book. I don't exactly subscribe to this. I think there's a lot of truth to that for sure, but it was much more than that.
I think they killed themselves. I think it was just oversaturation. But this is interesting. Tell me this story. So Warrant actually cut a demo song during the grunge era, and they had their manager strategically present it to the record label without the artist's name on it to avoid any negative stigma. And the label executive was reportedly thrilled to hear this amazing new song and insisted the band be presented immediately to be signed to a record deal and, fortune and fame. And then they told him it was Warrant. And then the record label said, we don't want anything to do with that. What song was that? I'm fascinated by it. I've never heard the story.
I had never heard the song title, believe it or not.
Okay.
And that's not a unique story. Tom Kiefer and Cinderella actually went through something very similar not so long ago. But yeah, I mean, anything that was even tangentially, peripherally, remotely related to hair metal, I mean, they wouldn't touch it. And you're right. I think there were other things that killed hair metal. The bands themselves, we talked about, I mean, the industry, certainly MTV, if the bands didn't do it themselves. But yeah, there was a lot of market saturation. There was some copycatting. I mean, I'm huge fans of these bands. But when you think about bands like Firehouse or Trickster, Nelson, Steelheart, Roxy Blue, Tora, Kick Tracy, Sweet FA, you can name them all day long. I mean,
you're pretty good at that.
They weren't exactly reinventing the wheel,
yeah.
Right? Nothing against them, but there was only so much demand against this infinitely growing amount of supply. And the bands were already changing their sound and style. We've talked about it some. Guns N' Roses, even when they did Appetite for Destruction, that largely ushered out the overly glam fashion. Right? Mm-hmm. A lot of that changed right then, and that was 1987. But even the sound of bands changed long before 1991. Cinderella did Heartbreak Station, which was much more organic. All the reverb was taken away. It was even more so, people would call it a country type album. Cherry Pie aside, the song, to your point, the record label made him right. He was trying for some different things. When you think about songs like Song and Dance Man or Mr. Rainmaker or even Uncle Tom's Cabin, it wasn't all partying and girls and sex and drugs and rock and roll again. Even Flesh and Blood by Poison, this is probably a stretch. They were trying to do things other than open up and say, and look what the cat dragged in. Songs like Life Loves a Tragedy or Something to Believe in. Skid Row went in a different direction. Mm-hmm. Even the Use Your Illusion albums had nothing to do with hair metal. You mentioned Blaze of Glory, right? The Blaze of Glory soundtrack did not sound like the huge, bombastic pop metal, hair metal, quote unquote, of New Jersey or Slippery When Wet. So the bands were already changing, but grunge was really just the tipping point.
Yeah. I mean, so it's kind of, yeah. I was just going to say, sorry, go on, finish.
I think you have to think about it, not just the music, right? I mean, you think about what was going on culturally even. Grunge was more connected, I think, to a generation that was experiencing a distinctly different political and socioeconomic climate than what was present during hair metal's birth in the mid-'80s. I mean, the 80s, for those of us that were there, I mean, it was all about big, bigger, excess, more partying, more drugs, louder, faster. It literally was nothing but a good time. But, as the shifted into the 90s, right? I mean, the bubble had to burst. The 80s came to a close. The economy wasn't doing so well. The shift was more grim and somber. And grunge felt, I think, more real to the new generation. It was the perfect medium if you were angry, sad, confused, depressed, and you want to embrace those feelings. I mean, hair metal offered you nothing for that. The average kid that couldn't relate to just having nothing but a good time anymore was able to connect. Personally, I was seeking the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. And then it was also the accessibility that we talked about. The average, I think, kids in the 90s, you might be able to appreciate what Motley Crue was doing on stage with this huge spectacle. But when you went to a Nirvana concert, here were guys that they looked like you. They could play guitar like maybe you could, and you could relate. And you could say, hey, this I know about. And rock music, rock and roll throughout the history of music has always been about rebellion, right? And that's why it sits so well with younger folks. But there's no rebellion in liking something as a kid that's already commercially king. Which hair metal was at the time. There was nothing to rally against.
Gotcha. But I mean, in 92, I feel like, there was still a little bit of life with hair metal, right? I mean, Bon Jovi cut their hair. That was kind of weird. And then, Warrant, they kind of went with like a biker, like black leather kind of look. And you are not a fan of Dog Eat Dog as much. I really like that record. I also like the Slaughter record, Wildlife. I thought that song, Wildlife, was so good. And you're not a fan of the Firehouse, Hold Your Fire. You thought it was a little bland and generic. And you said that helped hair metal dig its own grave. So that's why you say it's not all grunge. It was some of these albums, some of these things get a little bit stale, right?
Yeah, and trust me, I appreciate the Dog Eat Dog album for what it is. And honestly, candidly, somewhat more objectively, it's probably their best album in terms of songwriting and musical performances. For me at the time, I was part of the problem. I just wanted to hear the Down Boys again, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't want to hear Andy Warhol was right. Now, certainly, Machine Gun, I could groove to all day. But I didn't necessarily wanted to evolve with the bands at the time.
So did you like the Vince Neil Exposed record that you said that's a great album? That's your number one album of 1993.
Because, what Vince Neil did at the time was, tried to root himself purely in that late 80s sound, right? I mean, that record is basically a slightly more poppy Dr. Feelgood, right? So he definitely carried the torch. But I think it was MTV and the industry that shut it down.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, at the time, people like to think it happened overnight, but if you were there, it wasn't exactly overnight. I mean, it was sudden and it was abrupt, and I've never seen anything like it in terms of an industry and a musical style that just years earlier had been selling millions and millions of records. All of a sudden, nope, you're all dropped from your record deal. I mean, maybe disco was dropped just as quickly, but MTV said, listen, there's only going to be one thing here, and you have to choose. In 1991, I saw Alice in Chains open for Van Halen, and it was all rock and roll. We didn't want to choose as fans. I liked the Facelift album, and I had the Nevermind album. I thought, this is a cool sound, but I didn't know I was going to have to choose. I didn't know MTV and the radio was going to say it's one or the other, and that's pretty much what happened.
Right.
And then it did become almost this amazingly overnight phenomena where, again, you were just an absolute laughingstock if you had anything to do with 80s hard rock as we approach 1993, 1994.
Well, and especially, so that same year in 93, the Winger Pull album, which, a lot of people say it's their best album. I remember, when I became friends with this guy and he was really into music, and I loaned him a bunch of my CDs. And I think, I don't know why, I think I said, just check this out. There's a song that was on the rock charts. You might like it. And he was like blown away at that song Down Incognito. He's like, this song is so great. I'm like, yeah, I know. It's like, but it's one of those things where the stigma of that hair metal just hurt those guys so much. And that continues into 94. There's still some great records. And again, you mentioned this earlier with the Motley Crue self-titled. Now, like I said, I think you're kind of definitely more of a purist than me, but you really like this album. Explain how you like this album, because it shocks me. There's so much more where you go, this sounded too heavy. And I mean, because this album is really nothing to do with hair metal other than the name.
No, and honestly, I mean, I probably give off the wrong impression. I like a lot of the stuff that wasn't, purist, right? Not only this album, but, LA Guns put out Vicious Circle at the time. Bon Jovi did These Days, which, of course, I wasn't a huge fan of at the time, but in retrospect, you can appreciate it for what it was. I mean, Pull, I think, is absolutely Winger's best album. I even liked Def Leppard's Slang. I thought it was great. Most people hated it. But yeah, I loved Motley Crue 1994 because I just thought it was, absolute heavy as hell, right? I mean, this was a super heavy, amazingly brutal album, a lot like how we described Slave to the Grind. But, Karabi was a huge vocalist, right? Just extreme power. And the group was tight, and you had this dual guitar attack and these amazingly crunchy, hard-hitting, groovy songs. I loved it, and I was plenty happy because even though my heroes Motley Crue weren't together again, and we had Vince Neil doing his thing, and he still had the Motley Crue sound. So I embraced it wholeheartedly. I would have loved to see them do another album with Karabi in that style. Now, of course, I wasn't a fan of Generation Swine at all.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of great albums in the 90s that didn't necessarily have that sound. I mean, Great White had that very laid back, almost acoustic type album, Sail Away. Even the LA Guns album, American Hardcore. I mean, almost everybody would say this is a piece of garbage album, but it was very, Steve Riley and Tracy Guns were very much into Pantera at this time, and they said, we want to make an album that sounds like Pantera, and they did. And I still have some songs from that album on my gym playlist, right?
Yeah. What about and going back to 94, Dangerous Toys put out an album called Pissed, and Gilby Clarke Pawn Shop Guitars. I think those are two great albums. You don't put those in your best of 1994.
Yeah, I really like those. That's particularly like the Gilby Clarke album.
Yeah.
That was really a surprise to me in terms of just terrific songwriting. And again, real rootsy, organic, wonderful stripped back songs. I still play that in rotation today. The interesting thing was that Dangerous Toys album, the artist formerly known as Dangerous Toys, right? I don't know if you stumbled upon that.
Yeah. That was a little too much for me, but I thought the Pissed album was great, especially that first song, Pissed. And he does that live. I got to see him do it live. I was like, oh, it sounds so great. But then 95, Skid Row. Skid Row is probably my number one favorite band in high school. So I was really looking forward to this album, and I liked it. I mean, I don't think it was, in hindsight, in retrospect, I don't think it's as good as Slave to the Grind, but I found this interesting. I don't think I even knew this. You talk about in your book how Sebastian Bach had to kind of fight to get some of those screams on the album because Bob Rock thought he should sing more like Weiland from Stone Temple Pilots. That's a weird mix.
Such a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, the band was in tremendous turmoil at the time, right? I mean, the glory days were long past. They weren't getting along, even more so than they ever didn't get along. They were making the record under a different musical climate. Things had already started to go sour. They couldn't agree on things. And I do think the album has some good songs on it from a songwriting standpoint. And I don't think it holds a candle to their prior two. But I think what really plagued that album is the production. I almost can't listen to that album as far as the production goes. I mean, they got this drum sound that it's hard to describe. It's almost like a Saint Anger sound, although nothing could be like that. Metallica's Saint Anger album. But, there's this really bizarre drum sound. It's kind of thin sounding. And, Bob Rock was intentionally trying to strip back anything that sounded like the heavy reverb and the big bombastic 80s sounding hard rock album. But the production, I mean, Sebastian put in a tremendous performance, but yeah, Bob Rock was telling him, listen, Scott Weiland doesn't have to scream like this. Why don't you sing like that? And of course, Sebastian Bach wasn't having any of it. But the album, I think it just fell short for me and probably the band itself.
Yeah. And you don't like the Warrant Ultraphobic album. But I do think, you mentioned a couple songs that you liked. Do you not like the song Crawl Space? I felt like that was one of the better songs on that. It's kind of a catchy little tune. And the other one I really like on that, which I think Janie said it was his favorite song he ever wrote, was Stronger Now.
Yeah, I mean, Stronger Now is absolutely, one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's like a Beatles Blackbird kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the greatest songs, and Janie had just an amazing songwriter and a huge talent for being able to write songs like that. I mean, I love that song more than I can express. And it's funny you mentioned Crawl Space. I mean, that would, if I had to pick out a song other than Stronger Now and put it on a playlist, I would extract that one from the album. But that was the only song on the album that really had that, 80s melodic pop sensibility versus the other songs that were more, admittedly, alternative or grungy in nature. And again, I think the album is great from a songwriting standpoint versus what he was trying to accomplish at the time.
Well, and with that one,
what I was looking for, I didn't want to hear family pick about, spousal abuse and things like that. I was a stupid kid. I just wanted to party.
Yeah. So that one, it was kind of more like Janie wanted that sound, but then the Vince Neil, his second solo record, Carved in Stone, it sounds like it was more the record company was saying, you need to make it sound like this. And they were trying to kind of mold him into a different sound. And you're not happy with the results of that one either.
Well, I mean, Vince Neil's never been a prolific songwriter, if a songwriter at all, right? And that's just not something he's bringing to the band. So yeah, I mean, Warner Bros. At the time, I mean, he had one of the last, labels that actually cared what these bands were doing, or at least tried to care. And they said, hey, you're going to work with the Dust Brothers. And they, of course, had done the Beastie Boys albums and a couple other albums. And they were known for hip hop and street beats. And it was the record company saying, we're going to take your name and we're going to marry it with current things. And we think that will keep you relevant. And I think Vince Neil, he was going through some very, very difficult things at the time personally. Mm-hmm. And, he was probably up for doing something different from what I read. I don't think he thought it would turn out that different, right? He would leave the studio, come back the next day, and the Dust Brothers, kind of like via Axl on Use Your Illusion records, it didn't sound anything like what he thought. That record has a pretty different sound. There's a lot of hip hop elements to it, a lot of grungy stuff, something like Black Promises. Of course, and then you have this exception that the Skylar song, of course, written for his late daughter. But again, don't get me wrong. I appreciate what all these artists did in the 90s, and there's a lot of good stuff there. Poison's Native Tongue album, even the things that were more grungy, like Danger Danger's Dawn, or, the things Stephen Percy did from a solo standpoint. I think there's some great stuff there, and I listened to them. It just wasn't, as to your point, as a purist, what I was looking for from the band. But I was happy that they were evolving.
Yeah, because you list your top albums from every year, and this is when it starts to get a little bit slimmer. There's like, it goes from the top 20 to like 5, and then in 1998, you've only got 2 albums on your top albums of the year. So I think this is kind of where I not necessarily like stopped being a fan, but I just kind of was like, well, there's just no music coming out. But this was an interesting story you said in speaking of 98. Motley Crue and Skid Row, they put out some greatest hits album. The Van Halen 3, of course, that's a kind of a flop. But the Firehouse album, which I, never really listened to that too much, the Category 5, explain this story. You said the song Acid Rain, you were at a show where they filmed a music video and they played the song 3 times. So is this 3 times in a row, or did they play it like at the beginning, the middle, and the end, or how does that work?
No, it's 3 times in a row. And believe it or not, that was not uncommon for bands at the time, right? They would shoot the videos live with the crowd experience, and, to get every angle or every different thing they would need, they'd play the song multiple times.
Okay.
That just happened to be one I remembered, yeah. And that was an interesting album because a lot of these bands that, lost their footing in America, certainly, the same thing didn't necessarily happen overseas, right? Hair metal didn't get completely ushered out like it did with MTV in America. And particularly in Asia, a lot of these bands held their audience, particularly the bands that specialized in the power ballads, because the Asian audience really embraced the power ballads. So, bands like Steelheart and Firehouse and Mr. Big at the time, in the mid 90s, late 90s, they could go over to Japan and tour like Kings of the World, like nothing had ever happened, like grunge had never been invented. I think Firehouse at that time did a tour of all of Indonesia and sold out every show, like 20,000 foot. But when we come back in America, they couldn't have played My Backyard, I'll bet. So they wrote that album very specifically with that Asian audience in mind. And it was very much a softer, more acoustic type of record, and it did well there. But that was a commercial decision versus, the more pop heavy metal they had on their debut.
Yeah, no. And so then, like I said, there was a few years that were pretty sparse, but then it seems like it's kind of slowly coming back, partly because of like the VH1 Behind the Music and like the movie Rockstar came out. So there was like a little bit of a resurgence here. And then Guns N' Roses, they finally put out Chinese Democracy. What was this year? What year was this? Like
2008, if I remember.
2008. Right. So, and you kind of say it wasn't as bad as everyone says, but here's my thing with that album.
That doesn't sound like me.
or maybe that's what I think. I just put that in my notes, but because here's my thing is like, I think the thing is it should have been an Axl Rose solo album. Don't you agree? I mean, it's not Guns N' Roses, it's Axl Rose for sure. And I feel like his name is big enough that he could have called it that. I wonder why they didn't do that. If you ever thought of that.
Yeah. I mean, Axl felt that, he owned the name.
Sure.
And he worked hard for it, and he felt that he was going to rebuild that brand in his image, right? So he didn't want to sacrifice the brand power of Guns N' Roses. Was he big enough to call it an Axl Rose record? Absolutely. Would it? Now, of course, it wound up not selling anyway. But from a commercial standpoint, he would have been crazy to call it anything with Guns N' Roses, certainly. But you're right. I mean, as you got to the turn of the century, there was a legitimate resurrection of sorts, or rebirth. Now, these bands weren't going to go to immediately selling millions and millions of albums and have platinum records at snap of a finger again. And a lot of people look at the book title and they see it, The Rise, the Fall, and the Rebirth of Hair Metal, and they say, I remember the rise, I remember the fall. I'm not so sure about this rebirth thing, but it was a legitimate thing. As we got to the end of the century, nostalgia started to take place. I mean, people that were kids when they grew up with the music, they got to a place where, they were ready to go out on a Friday and Saturday night and try and relive some of their youth and sing the songs they knew. And the economy started to flourish again. I mean, you had the .com bubble, and the touring was really where it was felt. It wasn't felt with the record sales, but, you had these package tours. The band figured out they could go out with package tours and still play to 15,000 people if they put 4 or 5 of these bands in the same bill. And so you had Poison and Cinderella and Rat and Warrant and Quiet Riot and Slaughter and Firehouse all teaming up for these shows. And yeah, VH1 Behind the Music had a lot to do with it. Even, the LA station, Knack came back, and you had all these greatest hit CDs. And the artists, they were anxious to, at least some of them, to return to that style of music. Motley Crue, after the 94 album and the bizarre nature of Generation Swine, they returned to that guitar-oriented party rock with New Tattoo. Def Leppard came off of the alternative-sounding Slang and did Euphoria, which was very much like Adrenalize. Bon Jovi, of course, they were there at the beginning. They ushered it in with Living on a Prayer and Slippery When Wet. It was only so fitting that they would come in and do Crush, and It's My Life, I think, was the 3rd biggest single in the world that year.
Yeah, that was a great one. It's another good song that's like a newer song that's of the genre that sounds like it was made in that era was the Kicks album. The song, or the album was called Rock Your Face Off, but the song Love Me With Your Top Down, that is such a great song. Like, I mean, if people like this kind of music.
Wavered. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, God bless Kicks. I mean, you want to find a good album in the 90s that stuck to the formula, go find Kicks' Show Business album, right? It was their last straw from a major record, but they didn't change at all. I mean, God bless them. And certainly when they came back with Rock Your Face Off, again, it was 2015, was it? I might not remember that correctly. Again, it sounded just like Blow My Fuse or Kicks from the 80s, even though it didn't have Donnie, who did most of the songwriting. So yeah, you got to hand it to him. But all these bands were anxious to reunite. And Poison got back together with CC DeVille. LA Guns got back together. They did Man in the Moon, Cinderella, and Great White. I actually got new recording contracts, even though Cinderella, for various reasons we won't go into here, didn't get the record out. Mr. Big got back together. Of course, they didn't have Paul Gilbert, but all these bands, even though without Sebastian Bach, Skid Row got back together. And in 2000, it was kind of like this rebirth, and you can go out and you could see these bands and you could hear them live on a Friday and Saturday night. And, they were almost completely extinct, even though they're commercially extinct. Although a lot of them did take some downtime in the 90s. And they had this touring entity in the last 20 years that enabled them to make livings as a musician, right? They could go out there, and you hate to think it's all about nostalgia, although for a lot of people it is. I love new albums from these bands. And, as fans, hardcore fans that go to the concert, it's tough because you go to a Poison show and you're going to hear, God bless them, the same 12 songs you've heard. In any
didn't you say you stopped going to Poison because you said you just got sick of the same 10 songs?
I can't take the set list anymore, right? Now, it's great for the average fan because, what are they supposed to do? I would love Poison to write a new album as long as it doesn't sound like Hollyweird. Forgive me.
Yeah, but, that was a bad one. I think even the band has to, because I remember getting that and being all excited. Oh, a new Poison. I'm listening. I'm going, is this like the demos or something? Like, what is this production?
Well, the production was awful. Right?
Yeah, it just didn't
like
sound
it was recorded in my closet.
Strange. But so there's all these new hair bands, right? Steel Panther, I think they kind of ushered in this, and they used humor, which I think was great. I love them. I don't know if you're a fan of them. I know they're in your book, but I don't know if you see them live. If you care for their humor, I think their humor is hilarious. I think the shtick they do in between the songs is great. And I got to give some shout outs to a couple of bands that I've had on my show, some newer bands. There's a band called All or Nothing, which they're actually the backup band for Mitch Malloy, his solo band. That's a great band people should check out. There's a band, True Villains. Their singer, Bo, he was on American Idol. He sounds like Stephen Pearcy. And so people should check that one out. And I just had this band, Blackheart Saints. This guy, their singer, Josh, he loves Guns N' Roses. And a lot of their songs are kind of right in that era too. Now, which ones you have, like Hardcore Superstar, you've had like 3 of their albums in the top new hair metal artists. So you're a big fan of them. And who else do you want to give a shout out to for new bands?
Well, people have to realize that, overseas, hair metal's really never gone away. It's never gone away anywhere. It's just been underground, at least commercially. But when you go to places like the Nordics or Sweden or Finland, it's almost like, 1989 on the Sunset Strip. These are very commercially viable forms of music, and it's a thriving genre there. And there's tons of great bands. Too many to name. It's certainly Hardcore Superstar, though it's not really hair metal. It's more of a heavy, aggressive street metal. I'm a huge fan, of course, but bands like Reckless Love or Crazy Licks or Crash Diet or, all these bands, Kiss and Dynamite from Germany. There's literally, people that don't think there's new music out there, they should go find it because it is out there every day. There's at least 20 new 80s rock inspired CDs for me to listen to in any given week. More so than I could ever try to consume, although, that doesn't stop me.
Yeah, that's great.
Fantastic bands out there. That are carrying the torch. And I love Steel Panther, right? And they're kind of a love them or hate them thing because, it's amazing. They're embracing this music, but at the same time, they're making fun of it. And somehow, for me, at least, they're striking the right balance.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating when you go to their shows because there's young people there. And how they're pulling this off, I have no idea. But it is a fantastic show if you're looking for entertainment and some of that things that, these musicians and bands brought us in the 80s. I love them to death. Now, some of their lyrics, they maybe even a little, too, profound for me to use a lack of a better word.
Okay.
Maybe I would prefer that they do a more straight-faced album, but maybe that would take away what makes them for sure.
Yeah.
But when you listen to the music, it's straight out of 1989.
That's good stuff. Was there any bands that were big, that you would classify as hair metal bands that you just didn't get, or you think are overrated, or you're just not as big a fan of, that you think that maybe you should be a bigger fan, but you're just not for whatever reason?
I think everybody has those bands. For me, and again, any listeners out there, I don't mean to offend anybody, but I'll answer the question. I could never really get into Dokken, right? And that is sacrilegious because they were part of the pioneers of this. And, again, they had a lot of things that made them great. George Lynch is an amazing guitarist, and they had good songs that were the same as almost all the other songs in 1984, right? These were melodic guitar-based songs. I don't know what it was that I could never really embrace. And I own all their albums and I listen to them, but for some reason I never really just get excited about Dokken. So at the risk of offending anybody, I'll admit, I don't know what it is. I try and re-listen to their stuff all the time. And some of it I really do like, but I could never get into Dokken as much as the average person got into Dokken for whatever reason. But that's probably the only example.
Yeah. So, and then I heard you talking about that you've talked and met some of these rock stars. Like in 2003, you had a phone conversation with Nikki Sixx. You got to talk to Janie Lane, Sebastian. How did you do that? Like, how did you get a phone conversation with Nikki Sixx? Like, can I have his phone number? Because I want to get him on my show. Like,
well, he never gave me his phone number. I was writing an article for a paper at the time. It's actually a funny story. At the time, again, this is pre-internet. And so at the time, they were re-releasing all their albums. And they did it under this Crucial Crew moniker. And one of the albums was Supersonic and Demonic Relics. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But it had a bunch of unreleased stuff on there.
Oh, yeah.
And a friend of mine who worked for a newspaper in New Jersey at the time, he said, hey, there's actually a different version of that with some other songs that they've never released. And of course, I'm like, oh my God, I have to have this. And he's like, it was sent to me because I'm a journalist. They wanted me to review it because that's how you got exposure in those days. And I was actually writing for a paper at the time, and I had done a review that was submitted and published for I think several rounds. The latest one in the main paper was the Decade of Decadence album all the way back in 1991. But I said, hey, I'll reach out to their publicist. I'll let them know I want an interview. I'll probably never get one, but at least maybe they'll send me one of these rare CDs, right? That's what I wanted. And it turned out, they said, hey, sure, you can have an interview. And I was like, really? And there was a couple of things that went on, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. But eventually, I wound up on the phone talking with Nikki Sixx for almost an hour. And he was just the most down-to-earth, best guy to talk to. We had a great time. I published the article. Hopefully it got a lot of press, and I did him well. But that was, and a lot of the other folks I've met weren't any more than just, some extended time at some meet and greets or some backstage finagling. I do remember meeting Jani Lane several times, and I'm a huge Jani Lane fan. I mean, I just had so much respect for him as a songwriter and as a charismatic frontman. And I even, loved him as a vocalist. He could sing the phone book and I'd be happy. And I think he's just tragic every day that he's not still with us. But I do remember one specific occasion, and this was in the early 2000s when he was, and of course, Jani had his demons and his struggles with alcohol, and he was trying to get sober at this time. And it was in a small bar. And of course, I spent the show in the first row like a crazy idiot, like I always do. And I was talking with him backstage. And of course, he's sober, right? And it was cold and it was dark and it was dingy. And he was such a gentleman, just trying to meet as many fans as possible. And there's nothing worse than being around a bunch of drunk people when you're sober, right? If you've ever tried it. And so he was, playing the good soldier, and everyone around him was drunk. And someone approached him and spilled like an entire beer in his lap. And it was cold. I mean, just dumped it on him and didn't even care. And, the average rock star would have just went berserk. And, he just took it in stride, said, hey, it's okay. That's all right. Nice to meet you. Can I pose for a picture? I'll never forget that. It would have just an amazing moment.
That's crazy. Well, so I remember when I was a kid, and you wait a month to get the new Metal Edge. I was a big Metal Edge fan. And you just in hopes that there was like a small blurb about a band. I was like, is there anything about Skid Row? Maybe there's a paragraph. And now there's so many websites and podcasts and YouTube channels. It's almost too much information. Like, I can't keep up with it even if I wanted to. Do you find yourself in the same predicament, like trying to listen and watch all these interviews and then go on all these websites? Or are you still just absorbing it all the time?
Well, I'm a little abnormal. Like I said, I don't know what's wrong with me, but you're right. Most people wake up and they roll over, they grab their phone, they check the world news. I check, Blabbermouth and Sleaze Rock and Brave Words and some other websites. So again, I don't know what's wrong with me. It's just my passion, right? And hopefully that's what allowed me to write the book and have it be something valuable. But there's a lot out there, to your point, right? I mean, specifically the music. I mean, I try and keep up and listen to everything, but sometimes I find myself with a stack of 20 CDs that I haven't listened to yet. And it, you hate to say it's almost a chore, but it's like, how am I going to get through these? There's a lot out there to digest. And hopefully that just, separates, the cream rises to the crop. But it's difficult because not a lot of these bands get exposure. There's tremendous, fantastic music out there, but you kind of have to find it for yourself. And the beauty is you never know when you're going to find that next nugget, right?
Yeah.
You stumble upon this indie album that sounds like, wow, I love this.
Well,
right?
So yeah, you list a lot of the music in this book. There's a lot, and I'm going through. My girlfriend walked in on me, and I'm listening to music, and she goes, "You're listening to music while you read?" I'm like, "Well, I got to know what he's talking about." Like, he's raving about this Nelson song that I've never, I had to go on YouTube to find it because it's not even on Spotify. And I was like, "Wow, this actually is really good." Are you going to make like a playlist of all the music, like, because that would be cool to see? I don't know, either by year or. Probably by year would be the best way to do it, or probably by year would be the only way to do it. Like 1991 best hair metal songs, or what? I don't know. Like, because it's almost, there's so many songs that you list in this. I mean, unless people are just on Spotify and going through the book, I mean, you can't even hear all the things while you're reading the book. Does that make sense?
It does. And a lot of people have been kind enough to reach out to me and say, hey, the book turned me on to some music that I never knew was out there, whether it was all the bands that did release music in the 90s and people just didn't know about because it wasn't on radio or MTV, or something more modern And they've been, very gracious to say, hey, I never would have known about this terrific song if I hadn't read the book. And, as an author, that just warms your heart.
Oh yeah, no, the same for me, for sure. And I haven't like gone back and listened to all of it either. So there's still more that I need to go back and I only listen to some, but like some of them, like then I think it was the Nelson in particular. I remember you just raving about this, like, this is the most brilliant song they ever wrote. And I was like, well, I got to hear this. And like the White Snake, Flesh and Blood. I mean, there's so many that a lot of it I've already heard, obviously, but there was a lot of stuff too that's why I think it'd be cool if you made like a Spotify playlist or YouTube playlist or something.
Okay. I'm making a note. I can see if I can get around to that.
Or is there other what is your next project? I mean, cause this book is like everything. What else can you do now? I mean, you can't write another book about hair metal, can you? I mean, you pretty much covered it all. Would there be what happened to those 300 pages you deleted? Would there be like a supplement or director's cut of this book or?
Well, it's crazy to think that the book's already this beast at 450 pages, but you're right. The first draft of this thing was 800 pages. And it's really because I wanted to make it very, very comprehensive. Right? I didn't want to leave any bands out, and I wanted to cover everything and make it be, the encyclopedia for hair metal. And as it turned out, you just couldn't do it, right? Because not even the most ardent fan outside of myself maybe wants to read an 800-page dissertation about hair metal, not to mention the printing cost of it. I mean, you could never sell it. So cutting it down to 450 pages was really one of the most painful things I've ever done because you had to pick and choose. And you tried to stick with the bands that most people wanted to know about. At the same time, you certainly wanted to throw in some that would widen people's perspectives, and maybe you cheated and threw in some personal favorites as well. But cutting out or cutting down the amount of press certain bands got was awful because you just know I get a lot of the only criticisms I get from the book, and they're valid and they're wonderful because people are so passionate, is they say, hey, I'm upset because you gave this band 10 pages and my favorite band only got 5 pages, right? So I'm angry as a passionate fan. And, I actually love the criticism because I love that people are so passionate about it. But it's hard. It was hard to say, this band's only going to get 5 pages when I'd love to write 10 pages about that. So there's always room for more material. Some of the things I took out, like entire chapters, like I was going to go into great detail about the scene on the Sunset Strip at the time, but that's been covered in other books.
Yeah,
so that's not to say true. I wouldn't want to do maybe a one-off, maybe instead of 135,000 words like this book, maybe 25,000 words on the Sunset Strip scene in 1988 would be a good side project. So I think I'll probably dabble with some other small things, but no, I probably don't have another 450-page book in me. Hopefully I got it all out here.
Okay, no, you definitely did. People need to pick up this book. You can get it on Amazon. It's a fascinating read. I think and you wrote it for people who don't know anything about hair metal, but also like a diehard fan like me. You still uncovered all these gems of bands either I've never heard of or albums from these bands that I didn't know were really good that you turned me on to. So thank you so much for doing this. I do like to end each episode with a shout out to a charity. Is there a charity that you want to promote here at the end?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity. My wife and I are huge animal lovers. She actually owns a dog training company, and we have a dog that I love more than anything in life. And we work a lot with the Humane Society of Charlotte, North Carolina. And it's a wonderful organization. And if you're an animal lover, they could certainly use your help, and you can really make a difference in a pet's life. Okay.
Is that where you are now in Charlotte?
Just south of Charlotte. Yes.
Okay, just good to know. Okay, yeah, because you're such a mystery. Like there's just not a lot about your personal life. I don't know if that's on purpose, so I don't want to get too personal. But yeah, it's just like I'm like intrigued by. I'm like, you're just this hair metal fan that wrote a 450-page book. Like, how do you do that? That's crazy. So I love it. Great book. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview.
Okay. Hey, Chuck, always a pleasure speaking with other fans of the genre and being able to engage in this music that we all love. So thank you for the opportunity. Really enjoyed it.
All right. Stay in touch. See you later.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye. So there it is, the whole story of hair metal, but not really, because you got to read the book. So don't be saying that we missed this band or that album or that song or whatever, because we're just hitting some of the interesting points in this interview. The book contains so much more, so make sure to check it out. You can order it on Amazon. Again, here it is. The title is The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal by Christopher Hilton, covering his name there. But if you enjoyed the subject matter, make sure to check out some of the other interviews that I've done, many with members of the bands that we mentioned in this episode. And if you enjoy the show, make sure to follow me on social media and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen so that you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, and remember to shoot for the moon.